Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first formal presentation of Saturday of National Safety Month. We appreciate you taking the time out of your weekend on a Saturday morning to join the team. And this morning we'll be talking about currency and returning to flight, especially for those who may have been impacted by COVID-19 lockdowns. Before we get going, I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank our National Safety Month sponsors. We wouldn't be able to run campaigns like this if it wasn't for our sponsors. And we've got over $10,000 worth of giveaways to give away throughout the month of October. And by joining these streams today over the weekend, you get an additional entry in the draw for each presentation that you watch as well. As well as going back, make sure you've entered the weekly prize draws on our National Safety Month website to get the best chance of taking home one of those prizes. Our presentations today are sponsored by Garmin, who is a gold sponsor of National Safety Month. You can also check out their presentation. They'll be live with us tomorrow afternoon to run through some of their products. Just before we get started, if you've joined us online, on the right-hand side of your screen in the bottom right, you should see a blue chat box similar to that on the screen right now. If you hit that button, it should open the chat and Q&A panel in the right-hand side of your screen if that's not open already. Within that Q&A panel, you can enter any questions that you have for the team today in relation to the content that we've displayed. So, on that note, I'll bring in our operations team to discuss today's topic. Good morning, Jordan.
Morning.
Good morning, Jill.
Morning.
So today, topical topic at the moment, and not one that we would ordinarily be faced with, but COVID-19 has presented our community with a lot of restrictions, a lot of impact on our flying community. And this was really evident from our Week 1 National Safety Month content, where we put out a survey asking people how have they been impacted by COVID, and more importantly, what are they doing before getting back in the air in terms of managing their currency. And from the responses that we saw there, it was quite evident that a large portion of our members had been severely impacted by COVID-19 lockdowns. Jordan's at the airport. I can hear somebody's out flying, which is a good thing. But this is timely as we start to enter back into flying. The last couple of weeks have seen a lot of lifting of restrictions, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, where we've got a lot of members operating. So hopefully we get some benefit out of this. JB and JP.
JP. Morning, everyone. I guess the topic today is not something new. We've been banging on about this for a while because COVID's been affecting us for more than 2 years. Well, feels like 20 years, but 2 years approximately. And so we wanted to really focus on the sorts of things you can do as a pilot and an aircraft owner. I know Jared and Darren will be talking a bit more about that in their presentations tomorrow as well, but what can we do as pilots to keep ourselves safe? And I'm actually going to start at the bottom of our running sheet just to confuse the rest of the team, see if they're awake Saturday morning. Armchair flying. So I would like to hope that a lot of people have been doing this during lockdown anyway. I certainly remember doing hours and hours of armchair flying when I was trying to land that damn Skyfox when I was learning to fly. And when we talk about armchair flying, obviously we're talking about the fact that you sit there and you visualize what it is you're doing. You move your hands to the positions for switches. You visualize the movements and the muscle memory actions that you'll take to land an aircraft or fly an aircraft or do whatever it is you're trying to achieve. So Jordan, I'm going to throw to you and see what your favorite armchair flight is and what you used to do for armchair flying.
Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Cody. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I was saying before, armchair flying is the cheapest form of flying, and everybody should do it because you can put yourself in scenarios that you probably wouldn't in the airplane, or that would cost you a lot of money in the airplane. The one I used to do a lot was forced landings. And what I'd do is I would set a timer on my phone for 4 or 5 minutes, and just assume that, you're sort of 3,500 or 4,000 feet. And then I would go through my checks and try and get them done in that 4-minute period or 5-minute period, which then allowed me to make sure that I could do it in the time frame in the airplane. Now, obviously, armjet flying is a real benefit, but it's not the same as being in the airplane. But it makes a big difference if you can do it. The other one I used to do was diversions when I was starting my cross-country or nav flying. You want to try and be able to do a diversion on your lap. So I'd sit on a chair and I'd get it on my lap, on my knee board, and I'd try and work it out. I'd set a time for 2 minutes to see whether I could do it on there. The other one, you can take that a little bit further. When the airplane's not flying at your flight training school, go and sit in it. Go and get the checklist out and just do touch checks. So rather than trying to visualize it, go and actually sit in the airplane and go through it. And I encourage a lot of my students to do that with checklists, especially in the initial stages, because they spend a reasonable amount of time going through the checks, especially if you've got a more complex airplane with a large checklist. You spend a lot of money sitting on the ground going through checklists. So if you can just do touch checks and know where everything is in the cockpit by sitting in it when it's not being used, it'll save you a lot of money. And when you're coming back to flying, as we're talking about today in terms of currency, it's also really important to do, to go through that checklist, sit there and just visualize what you're going to do. So armchair flying, as I said, is the cheapest form of flying, and you can do things that you can't do in the real airplane. So we really suggest that you, before going back, and hopefully you've been doing it throughout COVID when you've been sitting at home, that you really take advantage of the armchair flying.
Wow, that's really good stuff. I just sat there and thought about flying around a circuit and trying to get the landing right. But even that is visualizing, okay, I've put the power on, I'm going to put rudder on, I'm going to keep the aircraft straight. Now I'm going to put a little bit of forward pressure on to get the tail up. Now I'm running along the runway, keeping straight. I'm looking forward. So you can actually kind of work your way through those scenarios. But I like the idea of the timer. I hadn't kind of thought about that. What about you, CC?
I certainly hadn't gone into that much depth either, but Jordan mentioned forced landings, and that's certainly one that I spend quite a lot of time armchair flying at home. Normally before a BFR or a check flight, but we shouldn't always leave these things to before we're going to be flying with an instructor, which is the point of today's conversation as well. But that was always one that, in the event of an engine failure, you need to know fairly quickly what you're going to do. You don't have time to hesitate in that instance. Going through your checks, knowing what you need to know off the top of your head and running through those. Some of the other ones that I used to run through in my head were your kind of standard checkpoints. So your Hazel checks in flight, or things like your...
You mean the hassle checks, the rest of it, the Aussie people call it, the hassle check?
Yeah. We call things different in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Also, your downwind checks as well. What are you checking as your downwind? And going through those checklists, like Jordan mentioned, a really good way to stay current. Another thing you can spend some time on the ground. It's not armchair flying as such, but making sure you're current and up to date with things like your EFB. Maybe learn some new skills. We did a live stream with Oz Runaways the other night where they gave some really good tips. It's a really good time to scrub up on those skills. The last thing you want to be doing is jumping up on flight and then pulling out your EFB and then trying to figure out, how do I set this up? It's not working for me. Suddenly your head's down on your lap looking at your iPad. You're not looking at your instruments. You're not conducting a scan. You're losing situational awareness, and there's a whole array of flow-on effects from there.
Awesome. So go.
Sorry, I've just got a couple of other things.
Sure.
Cody hit on there about the Hazel checks, as he says, Hazel checks. Another one that is really good to do is, if you've got a problem when there's a wing drop of using ailerons, is just sit there and just imagine back, forward, with the stick, and just try and ingrain that into you so that there is none of this at the point or following the stall. So that's one. And then we can take it even further as well. When you're driving in the car, I used to practice my radio calls, driving along in the car, practice my radio calls. If you're having trouble with the phonetic alphabet, when you see the car regos, Alpha Bravo Charlie, just pick them up and use that. So whether you're a new pilot or you're getting back into it after a while because you've been in lockdown, there's so many opportunities. And then we can delve into the reading books and watching videos. There's so many different ways that we can do this armchair type stuff without spending a cent.
I think I just drive along in the car going, oh, that'd be a good spot for a strip. That'd be a good spot for a strip.
That'd be a good spot to do an emergency landing. Oh, that would not be a good spot to do an emergency landing. Yeah, there's a lot of that. A lot of that sort of stuff goes on. And yes, I remember vividly turning left at the roundabout at such and such street when I was practicing my radio calls to do those things. So yeah, they're all really good examples. So then the other thing we can do as pilots, and it's probably a little bit less valuable for me walking 20 steps to the hangar, but on the way to the airport, you can actually start visualizing what it is you're doing, and you can start assessing the conditions of the day, because you can see the sky, you can see the wind, you can see potentially when you're driving towards the airport, the sort of traffic that's going on, you can see the sort of activity that might be happening at the airport while you're doing the prep on the plane, and while you're pulling it out and brushing it off and getting the dust off it and putting new fuel in and all those sorts of things. You're starting to develop that situational awareness picture of what's going on at the airport. Now, if you're flying from an airport where there's only you, okay, your situational awareness is you, but what about if there's kangaroos on the strip, or someone hasn't mown it, or there's some sort of issue with the strip itself, can't get the hangar door open, your tyres flat, you get all of these compounding things that will stop you from being very clear-headed and focused about what it is you're doing when you go flying. So that's the 5 Ps. We could call it 6, but the 5 Ps. Prior planning prevents poor performance. So there's that. And then even while we're taxiing out, what should we be looking for, Jordan, in the aircraft as an example, or in the airport, at the airport?
Obviously, other traffic. One of the things that you just mentioned there was wildlife and the state of the grass. If you've got grass around, somebody might not have been out there for 6 months. If everybody's been in lockdown, there might have been wildlife that have come onto the field or onto the airstrip or aerodrome that has kind of taken over a little bit, and they're not used to seeing aeroplanes where they would normally keep away because of aeroplanes. So all looking out for that kind of stuff. You mentioned the conditions when you're sitting doing your pre-flight, or when you're in the airplane, when you're doing your checks, or you're at the hold point, is to watch the airplanes that are coming into land and watch what their movement is. What's their sideways movement, up, vertical movement, to see what the conditions are like before you even get in the air, and see how they're handling it. Now, it might just be pilot induced
turbulence,
not errors, turbulence.
Pilot-induced turbulence.
But it could also be, if there's a consistent trend of what the airplanes are doing, then you can start to prepare mentally for that. So yeah, there are a couple of things that I would look at. And then, as you mentioned, you've got the airplane as well. If you haven't flown the airplane, if you've got a private airplane, you haven't flown it for a significant period of time, you want to make sure that it's doing the correct things, all the instruments are working correctly as you move around the airport, that the temperatures and pressures are coming up to where you want them, not getting too hot. So there are definitely things that you almost want to be hyper vigilant when you're coming back to flying and when you're not current.
I think that point is key there too, in terms of when you're heading out, and honestly, before you even head off to the airport, is monitoring those conditions in terms of what they're like. If there's quite a strong wind, or if it's quite turbulent, or if there's a reported crosswind at the airport, it might not be the right time to return to flight. And, that might be disappointing because you've been in lockdown for a while. It's your first Saturday or Sunday morning that you've had the opportunity to book a plane or to get out to the airport. And, you really want to go flying, but it's really important that you manage those personal minimums as you return to flight, and also expect that when you go and do that initial pre-flight of especially if it's your own aircraft that's been sitting for a while, there's going to be a bunch of extra maintenance tasks that you're going to have to do or you're going to want to look at before you consider going flying. So you probably want to dedicate, right, today I'm just going to purely go out to the airport and I'm going to get the airplane ready. I'm not going to try and fly. Today is dedicated just on that. I'm going to go and change my oils. I'm going to do a really thorough pre-flight inspection. I'm going to add new fuel into the system. I'm going to check everything really well, and that'll allow me to sort anything else out and just tinker if there's anything else there that, rather than dedicating, right, I'm going to go flying at lunchtime, I'm going to turn up at the airport at 10 a.m. and get everything done. Take that pressure off. Come back the next day and go flying, or, if the weather conditions aren't quite right, we might have to accept that, okay, we'll try again next weekend. We won't rush this.
Perfect. I was actually going to thread some of those things together. So the wildlife on the strip could also be wildlife in the aircraft. So it could be mice or rats. There could be spiders in the cockpit.
Snakes.
There could be snakes, especially with long grass. So there's all sorts of things that could turn up when we don't expect it. I like to turn the pre-flight around a little bit and say this aircraft is not airworthy until I prove that it is. So you don't go out there and go, yeah, everything's fine, poke, prod, touch, all of those things. You look at it and go, is this actually right? Is this cable running where it should be? Is there wear on that because it's rubbing against something against the engine mount? So you turn that philosophy around. And as you said, Cody, turn around the expectation that you will go flying that day. You say, I will only go flying today if the aircraft is right, the conditions are right, and I'm right. So there's three gateways that you need to get through before you go flying, so you don't put that pressure and that expectation bias on you. Okay, so let's say we've done all of those things. We've sat there and we've done our armchair flying. We've prepared the aircraft. We've given ourselves the right mental state. The conditions are right, like today. for me is a perfect day out there. There's no wind. There's clear skies. There's not much in the way of traffic at the moment because we're very lucky at tomorrow. So what am I going to do now? I'm out on the runway and I'm thinking about, or I have thought about this, but I'm now ready to commit aviation. Where am I going to go? Because a lot of us kind of just depart and go, shiny thing, I'll go and fly over there and see what there is. Maybe we should be going up and actually flying a specific task. I know in the military they call them missions, but we don't want to go down that path necessarily, but the concept is right. And Cody, if we bring up that flight tolerances, maybe the thing we could do first off is take off and say, I'm going to depart, I'm going to go to the training area, I'm going to climb to an appropriate height, I'm going to do a steep turn to the left and a steep turn to the right, or I might start with a medium or a gentle turn to start with, make sure I'm coming back and maintaining within 100 feet. And as I get better and more confident, make sure the aircraft's balanced and try a slightly steeper turn. And then I'm going to try a basic stall. And then I'm going to try a couple of variations on that potentially, making sure I'm comfortable and confident. I'm going to make sure I hit the height that I nominated to myself when I flew out. So I want to fly to 3,500. I'm not going to accept 3,400. I want 3,500. I might accept 20 feet as a deviation, even though on our flight tolerances there, we talk about 100 feet or 150 feet, sorry. And then I'm going to fly out and I'm going to actually give myself a simulated engine failure because no one practices those between BFRs. So I'm going to do those things, and because I've done my armchair flying and I've thought about all my checks, I've got those pre-prepared. I'm going to go and get down to the 500 AGL, do a go-around, thinking about managing the aircraft really carefully through the go-around. And then I'm going to go out and come back to the circuit, and I'm going to actually do some circuits because I actually like circuits. I know most pilots are kind of like, circuit, just got to get me there to get to the ground. I actually like doing circuits, and it's actually kind of funny that my husband and I basically share the flying. Obviously, we have a little bit of a competition where we put a block of chocolate on the line for the best landing for the day. So sometimes those competitions go for a while because, we go, I can do better. Oh, I can do better than that. I can do better. I want that block of chocolate. So we need to kind of think about what we actually want to achieve with the flight. Don't just take off and go flying around even though it's a beautiful day and just get lost in the scenery, because you're not really giving yourself any favour or benefit from that. Jordan, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, completely agree. Rather than just going out for a fly for the sake of it, go out and practice some things. Practice the things that you might not have done. And a good metric, as you said, is the flight tolerances that we have up on the screen here. to go, this is my aim. And it doesn't mean that you have to hit it, but it gives you something to work towards. It gives you a metric to measure against, and they're really important. I'll take the conversation a little bit further and then talk about, so what are some other ways that we could do it? We could go and do a flight review, even though our flight review might not be due for another 12 months or 18 months or whatever it might be. We can go and do a flight review to make sure that we are to the correct standard, or the standard that's required. And we can learn some things again. You've got that safety benefit or safety assurance of having an instructor there with you. So it's really a good way to ease back into flying. The other way to do it is to do some endorsement training. You don't just have to go and do the same a BFR or the same flying as usual. Go and enjoy something else. Go and do a tail endorsement or a float, waterborne float, or waterborne hull, or a low level endorsement, or something like that. It's going to be useful to you. You can get current again, which is obviously the point of today, is currency, and learn some new skills, and that'll of course reset your BFR. So there are a number of ways that you can get back into flying that'll sort of ease you back in, and these flight tolerances are a really good way to measure against.
I think that's really key there that you mentioned in terms of easing back into flying. The last thing you want to be doing for your first flight back is setting a cross-country flight out to an unknown destination where you're then putting additional pressure on yourself. Your situational awareness is going to break down even more than it would otherwise because you're not current. Don't set too much expectation and pressure for yourself, but go and touch base on some of these normal checks and emergency procedures. And be aware as well, if your aircraft hasn't flown for a while, there is an increased likelihood of experiencing an engine failure. So it is really important that you spend that time on the ground going through what am I going to do in the event of an emergency after takeoff, and running through that pre-takeoff safety brief, and then going and checking some of those things in flight once you're airborne. And as was mentioned earlier, really making sure those temperatures and pressures and everything are really looking good before you take off.
Yeah, it's really, really important stuff. Let's have a look at the, well, actually, I was just going to have a look at the flight tolerances in more detail, Cody, if you can put it back up again. Thanks. Let's have a look at what this actually means, though. So it says taxiing the aircraft within plus or minus 1 metre of the centre line. So the reason that's there is not to drive you crazy with an instructor saying get the nose well in the centre line. It's a nice professional thing to do. But it also makes sure that the aircraft isn't going to infringe any obstacles, because the centre line on the taxiway gives you a known clearance. So we're not saying that just to annoy the heck out of you as instructors. We're actually saying that's how I know you're in control of the aircraft. And likewise, when you take off, if you deviate from that centre line by a metre, which, as Ken said yesterday, is about the width of the main undercarriage, if you get that far off the centre line, how does the instructor know you're going to, or how do you know you're going to regain that centre line, or at least parallel it, without making sure you don't set that as a tolerance? And same deal with nominated heading. When we're flying around just locally, we often don't look at the compass much, but we could actually say, hey, I want to actually head due west for the first 5 minutes to get out to a training area or an area which is clear, and then I want to turn onto a heading of south or north, and what's the compass going to do, and what's that going to mean, and where am I actually going to set as a point to reference to for that turn. I don't want to go through these in a whole lot of detail because I don't want to bore people, but turning on to nominated headings and landing and touchdown. So when we've come back from a long break, we could kind of go, any landing on the runway anywhere is pretty good, and you're right. But what we could be working towards is saying, I want to land, at the first marker out inside the runway keys, or I want to land alongside the second white marker on the side of the runway, whatever it happens to be. So you are being accurate when it comes to touchdown, because one day you're going to need to do that.
And more importantly with that, both jump in at the same time, knowing when it's not looking right, rather than trying to stick it, go around. We see so much damage from aircraft because, people think, I can recover this, rather than making that early decision. No, it's not quite looking right. Take the pressure off yourself, put the power back on, do a go around, and tidy it up for the next circuit. Sorry, Jordan.
No, that's fine. I was just going to go back to an earlier thread. If you apart from the usual stalls and forced landings or engine failures from height, you can actually use the left side of this as a bit of a checklist. So I'm going to focus on my taxiing, then I'm going to depart, as Jill said, on a nominated heading. I'm going to focus on my climb speed, a power off descent, glides, turns. So you can go through and use it as a bit of a checklist to make sure that you've actually covered everything. And then, of course, you've got the tolerances on the other side that you can measure against your flying. So it's a really useful document to use when you're coming back into flying, or just generally working on your flight proficiency during your BFRs or things like that.
And that's a really important point, Jordan, too, because what we see when we do flight reviews generally as instructors, I think, is the fact that the pilot hasn't done a practice force landing, pilot hasn't practiced a stall, hasn't practiced crosswinds, and possibly hasn't used a checklist. Now, we get comfortable in our own comfort zone. We know our aircraft. We know we don't have a fuel pump. We know we've only got one fuel tap. We know we don't have a mixture control. We might not have carby heat. So most of those things on that checklist seem irrelevant until we get into another aircraft. And one of the things that I found from my career of jumping into different aircraft with different people is having those timpfish and bumfish checklists in my head means that I'm going to get more comfortable and familiar with that aircraft that I'm flying for the first time with someone that I've never flown with, because I'm using the same checklist consistently. And whatever is not applicable is just not applicable. Undercarriage, better be bolted, not necessarily retractable. So checklist, I think, is probably one of the other things that we can use as pilots to just make sure we don't miss things. We might forget to set flaps because we haven't used a checklist. We might not select the right fuel tank. All of those things are important. But I want to circle around to some interesting stuff, Cody, from the safety perspective as well. We've already had a couple of reports of engine failure and a loss of control, and they relate directly to areas that were in lockdown until a couple of weeks ago. So an engine failure in an aircraft that was departing from a location after a considerable break, and we're talking about Victoria basically, and departing to go to somewhere for some maintenance or some work, suffered an engine failure. The pilot did a very good job landing where there was an open paddock, but obviously the unfortunate consequence was the paddock was quite rough and therefore the undercarriage got damaged. So we've gone from being a flyable aircraft but not necessarily recently flown, a pilot who may or may not have flown recently, and we've then had to add an emergency, which is probably the worst possible scenario or outcome. The other one we had was a loss of control with a solo student who basically didn't realise that the first landing that they did caused damage to the aircraft. And that's actually one that I want to circle back to as well, and talking about hard landing checks and the fact that if we have a landing which is a little bit outside the norm, we shouldn't continue until we check the aircraft. In that instance, the aircraft had prop damage, it had nose wheel and spat damage, and possible firewall damage, and the student wasn't aware, hadn't been able to be in contact with the instructor who was calling on the radio, and did 3 and 4 more circuits. Now, that could have actually turned out to be quite disastrous. If the undercarriage had folded up or something else had happened on the aircraft, you've got a compounding series of problems with a student who may have only returned to flying in the last couple of months after a lockdown. So all of those Swiss cheese holes lined up for those 2 incidents, and that's just the first 2 we've had in the last couple of weeks.
I think that's really important there, particularly in relation to if you have a hard landing. The nature of our aircraft at RAOs, they are built lightweight. They've got to fit within a weight category, and therefore the materials maybe aren't as strong necessarily as some of the heavier aircraft where weight's not so much of a factor. So I think it's really easy to encounter a situation like a hard landing. We all have them from time to time, but you can really underestimate the damage that can do in terms of cracking in the undercarriage, or further damage that might go unnoticed. I've experienced this when I was flying commercially skydive work in New Zealand, where we had a pilot who knocked a cone on the side of the taxiway as he was taxiing out, and rather than getting out and checking, he continued with the flight. Didn't seem to be a problem, and when he returned back from that flight, there was actually significant damage to the control surfaces from hitting that cone, which didn't seem like, it just seemed like he knocked it over as he taxied past. it just goes to that extra attention to, okay, something's not quite right. Let's just check that. And let's make sure we do a hard landing inspection on our aircraft and record that in the logbook if we do have these things, because if there's some underlying damage that goes undetected, it might not be today, it might not be next week, it might be 3 months down the track. You come in, you have another little bit of a harder landing, and suddenly your undercarriage folds up, and we see that a lot. But just while we're touching on aircraft quickly, Jared's quite correctly pointed out as well that not only are people now coming out of lockdowns, but for the first time they might be getting the opportunity to actually travel and go and see family. So they might be locking up the hangar, grabbing the caravan and traveling for the next 3 months because they haven't had the opportunity to do so. So it's not just necessarily lockdowns that are stopping us from flying. There might be other things that are coming up that we want to go and do and explore, which also take us away from flying. And I think it's really important there to go through your maintenance manual to check what's in there in relation to preparing your aircraft for storage or long-term storage of your aircraft. I know we've got a presentation tomorrow on returning your Jabiru aircraft for preparing and returning from storage. And they've got really detailed information in their manuals as to the steps that you should take when you're going to be doing these things. And there's some standard considerations when your aircraft's been sitting for a while, such as replacing your oil, as that can absorb moisture, replacing your fuel, especially if you're using car fuel, MoGas. That fuel deteriorates really quickly. I think it's only a couple of weeks before BP recommends that new fuel is added. So if that's been 3 months, you really don't want to be using that fuel. It can result in detonation and further damage to your aircraft, which can have fairly significant outcomes. So spend that time, go through your manuals, and make sure that's all checked as well.
Did you have something there, Jordan? You're writing notes?
Yeah, I just wanted to take that a little bit further, and we've talked about what we can do in the flight. We've talked about the aircraft, but why don't we talk about ourselves? So what about our knowledge? We talked about weather before, so we might check the air services NAPES and forget how to read the weather. So you've got the BOM Knowledge Centre that you can go and do some study to make sure that you understand how to read the TAF, the GAF. If you haven't flown for a while, there's a TAF 3 that's come out. So there's been some changes that you can study up on. The other thing that when we talk about pilot and aircraft is making sure you've got current membership and current registration. We haven't, you might not have flown for a while. You might have gone, oh, I'll let my membership or my registration lapse because I'm not going to be flying because I'm in lockdown. Well, you need to have a current flying membership and a current registration of the airplane to actually operate an RL's aircraft. So some things that you can do even before you leave home to make sure that you remain compliant are really important to do.
It's a good one. And then we've also got the tool, 20 cents in the tin, Cody.
Yeah, that's the one. As well, just making sure that personally you're safe before returning to flight. Make sure you go through that I'm safe checklist. Don't return to flight if you've been on night shift throughout the week and you're a little run down or you've got a cold, something that might be impacting your health.
And we've got these 2 resources in the handout section there as well. But this is the important one. I'm going to look at the one on my screen because I can't read that one. It's one of the downsides of getting older. But the currency barometer we produced last year when COVID first impacted, and it's even more relevant now. So let's do an example for a pilot who's been in lockdown in Victoria for what seems like most of 2021, 22, 20 and 21, you know what I mean. So they're starting at the on the left-hand side with the hours in the last 6 months. So let's say that they have started at 5 hours. So they're at the top of the red, effectively. And in that flight, in those flights, they basically only did 5 landings, which means they're crossing across to the first or midpoint on the yellow. And at that point, we say, exercise caution, stay within your limits. You may not be as good as you think. Consider a flight check and be cautious, particularly if operating outside your normal operations, for example, at a new airfield, in a new type of aircraft, flights after maintenance, or in high traffic operations. So I'm reckoning that most of the pilots that have been stuck in Victoria's lockdown, it was kind of like it's on, it's off, no, it's on, no, you're back off again. you're going to be at the bottom of that currency barometer. But even if you're having done at the top of the green or at the middle of the green 12 hours in the last 6 months, there's not really a lot. But in that time, you only did 3 landings because you flew for 4 hours and managed to get, away from wherever you were, which is a bit of a dream for a lot of people. It will take you straight to the you are rusty. Being out of practice, your skills will be rusty, even if you're operating at your home airfield in your own aircraft. RAL strongly recommends you conduct a flight with an instructor to brush up your skills and ensure local weather conditions are within your personal limits prior to flight. So that's basically a quick summary of what we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes, effectively using that currency barometer. Obviously, if you're at the top of the green, happy days, 15 plus hours, 25 plus landings, you're good, but you need to remain focused and vigilant because now you might be complacent. So, we're never happy. You're either rusty, you're either needing caution, or you're going to be complacent. But I think it's actually not intended to be anything more than just a reminder to people that we shouldn't assume, and that we should always ensure that we've done everything we can to put the odds in our favour. So, both those handouts are on the handout section. They're also, for our instructors, they're both available as tolerance and currency barometer resources in the instructor portal. And I think, are they on our normal website, Cody? I can't remember.
I know that they are on our, not the flight tolerances, but the currency barometer is available from our currency page, which was week 1 of National Safety Month content.
Yep.
And also on our COVID-19 information source as well on our website. So certainly, use that barometer as guidance. It's not a you must do this, but it does provide some basic guidance. But also consider, have you done your 3 takeoffs and landings within the preceding 90 days? Because if you haven't done that, there's other implications. Obviously, please don't take a passenger when you're first returning to flight. There's an added level of distraction that you don't necessarily need in flight. But also, if something were not to go to plan, then it's also putting someone else at risk. But I think the key point, if anything, that I would recommend is certainly, please, if you haven't flown for a while, particularly if you're a low-time pilot, under a couple of 100 hours, would really recommend just go out to your local flight training school, pick up the phone, talk to an instructor. They'll be able to give you some guidance on your specific circumstance. You might not have to go out and spend an hour or 2 hours flying with them. It might simply be, can you come out for me for my first 2 circuits, just to make sure I'm comfortable? And then you can jump out. I'm going to go out there into the training area and do a little bit more and become comfortable. But I just want someone there for my first couple of takeoffs and landings, so that you're not obtaining that expense. But they might also teach you something new throughout that process. Like Jordan said, we'll go and do your BFR. It'll refresh you, especially if it's coming up in the next 6 or 12 months. Then you've done it again. You're good for another 2 years. You've bundled it all into a nice package and you're safe to return to flight.
I was smiling there because I had a neighbour ask exactly that. They hadn't flown for a while. So I said, can you just come and sit in the right seat with me? I sat in the right seat, said nothing. They did a wonderful job flying circuits, flying the aircraft. We taxied back. I said, are you happy? Yep. They said, you didn't say anything. I said, sometimes all you need is someone to sit there and say nothing. It's just having that presence of someone there that might pick you up on, hey, you just forgot to turn your fuel pump off, or you still got your flaps out. Just that kind of oversight. But if you've done nothing wrong, then they just should sit there and let you do your thing, with just like a bit of a safety blanket sitting next to you, I suppose.
Should we flash your mobile phone number up on the screen, Jill, and you can fly with anyone who wants a right seat passenger?
Could do that. You could do the same. I'm sure any of us would be happy to go jumping in the aircraft with people. Sure.
Our schools have also been hit hard by COVID as well. So it's not only for yourself, it's also helping the flight training schools or flight training facilities to regain the lost business that they have lost because they've been in lockdown. So there's an added safety benefit and assurance for yourself. And as Cody said, you might learn something, which is always good. but you're also helping the instructor or the CFI or the flight training school owner who might have done it tough as well because they've also been in lockdown and can't fly.
It's a very fair point.
Absolutely.
When you're in that situation, it is very important, though, to ensure that you clearly articulate who's going to be in charge. And it will be, you would hope the instructor has done the same things. And we certainly expect our instructors would have gone out and done some personal practice to get proficiency themselves. So in the event of an emergency, prior to having the emergency on the ground, you should be sitting down saying, look, I've got more experience overall, but you know your aircraft better. So if we have this emergency, I want you to fly the plane and I will, manage the radio and look out for traffic or whatever. Or if we have a different type of emergency, I'll fly the plane while you troubleshoot what the issue is. So even just having that discussion prior to taking off will save a little bit of cockpit confusion in the event of something actually going wrong.
That's right.
Okay, well, I think we've talked through most of our points. We've obviously made our audience go to sleep because there's no questions whatsoever that I can see. Is there anything anyone wants to finish up on in the last couple of minutes? Cody?
Final thing I'll say is before we wrap up, on our website, week 1 content of National Safety Month looked at some of our top 10 tips in terms of returning to flight. Go and have a look at that information there. Spend a bit of time before you get back in the air. And there's also some tips there as well in relation to preparing your aircraft before flight. So go and have a look at those resources online. Spend some time considering some of the points that we've spoken about today and return safely back to flight.
Awesome. Jordan?
Obviously, if you've been in lockdown and being in South Australia, I've been very lucky to not experience that. So I don't really know too much how people feel. But obviously, there will be a sense of excitement and anticipation when getting back in to flying, which is really good. And we're very excited that our members can actually get back to go flying because that's why we're all here. That's why that's what we love. But just as Cody said, take some of the points into account that we've talked about today. Just do that practice before you go and just think about all these things. The last thing, we want you to have a successful flight and a successful series of flights as you get back into flying and regain that currency. The last thing we want to be is talking to you about an incident or an accident. So we just urge you to use some of the things today, use your head and just ease back into your flying so that there is no mishaps. And as we said, we've already seen them and we don't really want to see any more. So just take care and enjoy yourself when you get back into that aeroplane.
Fly for some fun. Yep. The last thing I'd say is talk about is setting some goals. So the goals will be the first flight will be safe and trouble-free, and I'm going to do these 3 things or this one thing and achieve the particular tolerance. Or the goal might be my personal goal for flying now that I'm not instructing anymore is to do an hour a week, which will give me a minimum of 50 odd hours a year, weather and other life situations excluding. And I think that's, 40 to 50 hours a year is getting to the absolute minimum that I would be comfortable with of making sure that I'm current and recent. If I can do more than that, then that's terrific. So if you have a look back in your logbook and you haven't done 50 hours last year and you've been in lockdown and you haven't actually flown anything in the last 3 or 4 months, you are really stacking the odds against you in terms of your proficiency. So have a think about that and set the goals of what you want to try and achieve in the short, medium and long term for your flying, and including your aircraft. I think we're done. I think I'm pretty happy with what we've discussed there. We've got one more. Good on you, Nicholas. Nicholas Reese, if you have a flight simulator at home, jump on it, go through your sequences, treat it as the real thing. Better than nothing and good for getting your brain back into flying mode. That's even better than armchair flying because you actually get to see some stuff that you would expect to see out the window. That's a really good point, Nicholas. And maybe there's some schools that might have simulators as well that you can jump in and do some time in before you actually go and commit aviation for real.
There also are some great resources online. At the start of COVID, we did some work with GoFly Online, who have a bunch of video resources and work through a lot of these scenarios. They've got a lot of great video content. So go and have a look for those resources. There's a link to them on the RL's website as well, to brush up on those skills before you get back in the air.
Perfect. All right. Safe
Thanks,
flying,
team.
everyone.
Thank you.
Good discussion.
Yep, I think so.
Thank you very much. See you
Bye,
later.
everybody.
Bye.
Alrighty, guys. Thank you very much for joining our first session for our Saturday sessions. We've got a bunch of other presentations throughout today. But first of all, before we do that, I'd just really like to thank our National Safety Month sponsors. We do have those $10,000 or more than $10,000 worth of giveaways for our National Safety Month. And today's sponsor of today's seminar series is Garmin, who's a gold sponsor of National Safety Month. Have a look for their presentation tomorrow, where they'll go through some of their products as well. Of course, thanks to all of our sponsors for National Safety Month and the support. Couldn't have done it without you. Thank you for tuning in. There's a bit of a list of what we've got coming up today. I'm back on at 10 a.m. this morning. We'll be talking about safety reporting. We've also got some other good discussions coming up later in the day, such as loss of control, which is obviously a key area of safety focus for RALs, number one cause of fatal accident, and of course for aircraft damage as well. We've also got Jill with Alerted See and Avoid this afternoon, which is another key focus area with a lot of near-miss events that are reported to RALs. And finishing off this afternoon, I've got a discussion with Dan Compton and Tim Howes, a Bushflyers Down Under team, to discuss bush flying and some of the safety considerations there. So lots of great content. And tomorrow, of course, we're focusing on maintainers and aircraft and equipment, with some more great presentations as well. So keep tuning in. Thanks for joining us today, and we really appreciate it.